Guys, you're never going to believe this, but in 2022, I got an angry comment.
Thank you. You're too kind. And you're just brown nursing.
Yeah, whatever, Dama doesn't know all that, but this one stuck with me. The comment was made on my review of Callisto Protocol, angry at my oxymoronic statements about the game's level design. Quote, so you say the game's too linear, then complain about the fact that you got lost. Make that make sense. Okay, I'll make it make sense. I mentioned in the level design section of my review that the game is so linear that players can largely autopilot through the game. Then, in an obviously hypocritical move, I explain how it's also very easy to just get lost and wander aimlessly for extended periods of time. Why? Why did I do that? On paper, yeah, that makes no sense. Well, for one, that isn't what I said. I actually did explain what happened both literally and in concept, and I was ignored. For two, there's a very simple reason why you can get lost in a linear game. So let's examine the Callisto Protocol to see what happened, why, and what could be done to fix it. Let's make it make sense. The Callisto Protocol is a game which gives the player literally no way to actually identify where they're supposed to be going. Instead, it relies purely on visual cues and its own linear level design to drive the player forward and hope they don't get lost. However, if either one of those two things fail to grab your attention, then the game just kind of breaks.
I'm in danger!
If the player misses something, then there's just no backup plan, mechanically. For example, the Callisto Protocol has no map system, no passive objective markers on the HUD, no active objective markers or objective waypoints that the player can set for themselves or trigger themselves, and no way to see if you've ever even been in a room before. Granted, having all of these can very easily seem patronizing and overly handholdy, but I would argue that you should put in at least one of them. No one is perfect, and that goes for both players and developers. Players are going to make mistakes, and developers can't design everything to be perfectly airtight in games that are as complicated to make as the Callisto Protocol. Someone will inevitably miss something. It just so happens that I managed to miss a particular door. The door in question is very early in the game when you reach the armory through a vent in the wall. It's already been looted, save for a single stun baton, and the only door in the room is locked. You get a call from the only reasonable human being that you're going to speak to for the entire game, telling you to meet him on the other side of the watchtower. By this point, you've seen the watchtower, and you as the player know exactly where he's talking about. As a matter of fact, you've already broken into that watchtower on a lower level, and it's where you got the crowbar that you've been using as a melee weapon until literal seconds ago when you replaced it with the stun baton. The objective that pops up on your screen even says return to the watchtower, meaning that the game acknowledges it's a place that the player has already been to before. And where is the watchtower? Well, it's all the way back where you started. It's literally where you came from. That might sound annoying, but hey, at least you got a new weapon for the trip back, so things are gonna be a lot easier this time around. Except that's not what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to go back at all. What you're supposed to do is go through the locked door. The way you're meant to do this is by interacting with the security station and lifting the lockdown on the prison, except the only indication that this is what you're meant to do is this small diamond icon and nothing else. Worse yet, the objective that you as the player are now looking to accomplish isn't to lift the lockdown. And even if you notice the console's interactable, there's literally no indication whatsoever about what lifting the lockdown has actually done for you. No audio cue, no update to your objective. The only way you would know is by checking the door that you already know is locked, and then notice that it says unlocked now, which in my playthrough was on screen for roughly this many frames. So in my case, given that as far as I know, the only door in the room is still locked, the console gave absolutely no indication of what undoing the lockdown actually accomplished for me, and I am supposed to return to a place that I've already been to before, everything points to the fact that I must have unlocked something back at the part of the tower that I visited before, and I can progress from there now. Thanks to that incorrect hypothesis, I guess I'll call it, I spent the next 10 to 15 minutes backtracking from dead end to dead end, making no progress whatsoever. Incidentally, there's another security room that's still screaming lockdown everywhere, even after you lift the lockdown. So in hindsight, I still have no idea, after like 4 playthroughs, what all of these screens in the armory are actually meant to be showing, seeing how none of them show the door in the room, and I'm pretty sure the literal only thing that lifting the lockdown did was unlock a singular door, but I digress. Boiled down to a couple sentences, the Callisto Protocol relies on visual cues like the little objective diamond and the green unlocked hologram on interactable doors, and its admittedly fantastic use of lighting, to indicate how the player is meant to traverse forward in the world. However, if any of these visual cues fail to hook the player's attention at any point or for any reason, the game provides no way for players to salvage the situation and get themselves back on track thanks to the game's lacking any form of map, objective, or hint systems. What the Callisto Protocol does is produce scenarios where it's possible to reach a dead end to which there is only a single solution without competently communicating what the solution is, or even that there is indeed only a single solution. This can lead to players getting stuck until they get by through trial and error, cheat by looking it up, or at the very least, try to figure it out by using their experiences with other games as reference, for better or for worse. So that's what happened with the Callisto Protocol and why. And now, because I don't want to just dunk on it without being constructive, how do we fix it? To keep things consistent, let's say that we still aren't allowed to add anything to the game that it doesn't already have. We can't use any tools to help guide the player that the game doesn't already use. Easy. Instead of using the red locked hologram, use a different hologram that says lockdown in effect, or just the word lockdown in red. This will connect that door to the concept of a lockdown in the player's mind, and when they notice the console and lift the lockdown, they'll have that connecting thread that will lead them back to check if the door unlocked now that there's no longer a lockdown in effect. Alternatively, you could also just change the written objective in the first place to say, disable the lockdown, find Elias. Don't even mention the watchtower. It's not relevant knowledge to the player in terms of where they need to go or what they practically need to do at the time. Likewise, don't say anything like regroup with Elias. Finding him implies exploring forward and discovering him again, while regrouping with him will give the same indication as returning. It means that you need to go back and meet him where you were. And on that note, let's answer the exact question, and finally, make it make sense. How is it possible to get lost if a game is linear? Well, like I said before, the answer is deceptively simple. Just because a game's level design is linear does not mean that a game's level design is intuitive. To be crystal clear, a linear game is one where your goal as the player is to go from point A to point B, most often by traveling in a single direction relative to your controller input, such as always going from left to right, or always going forward by pushing forward on the stick or W on keyboard, with little to no exploration of or backtracking to previously traversed areas. In the case of the Callisto Protocol, the solution is to always push W, but the scenario that I described is only about a half hour into the game. By that point, you've barely gotten past the tutorial, and it isn't at all clear whether or not the game is actually linear, or if it's going to branch out and expand with time. Spoilers, it freaking doesn't. To nip something in the bud, being linear is not inherently bad. Being unintuitive is. Tons of games, if not a majority of games throughout gaming history, are linear for most of their runtime. Most games aren't open world or even semi-open world. Heck, the godfather of all gaming, Mr. Mario himself, is arguably the single most famous example of linear games. And yet, he provides what is also the most easy example to demonstrate the difference between good intuitive level design and bad unintuitive design, both of which just so happen to be linear. Let's look back to the very first level of the very first Super Mario Bros., a level so iconic I have a poster of it on my wall. You start on the left and you can't go any further to the left. If you go right, the screen moves to reveal more of the level. Continuing right, the player immediately finds two things: a glowing question mark block and a lone Goomba. These first few seconds have already taught the player a few things. 1. Moving to the right progresses the game. 2. As you progress the game and reveal more of the screen, you're going to find more of these blinky item boxes as a reward for moving forward. And 3. Moving forward also carries a degree of risk, as you're going to be revealing enemies too. The expectation this creates is that the way to progress is to the right, and if you're progressing, then you're going to find both enemies and item blocks. If you're not finding new enemies or new item blocks, you're probably going the wrong way. This basic framework was so good that it kept being iterated on even 21 years later in games like New Super Mario Bros. DS in 2006, which shares the exact same opener as the first game. As far as you can to the left, moving to the right reveals item blocks and a single enemy. But moving just a little further to the right and progressing just a bit more reveals something that has become a staple in Mario games: the coins. Now, even more clearly than the enemies or the item blocks, if you're finding new spinning coins that you haven't picked up already, you know you're going the right way. Heck, even if we ignore that and we go to an in-between point like Super Mario World, the pipes in Yoshi's Island were slanted in the direction that the player is intended to go. Intuitive level design is all about showing the player where they need to go without explicitly needing to tell the player where to go. A level is intuitive if it's been designed in such a way as to guide the player along with subtle yet consistent cues, which leads to a sense that the player is figuring out the world all on their own. Things like maps or objective waypoints aren't wrong or bad, but they are effectively crutches to lean on when A, the world presents too many options for the player at once, and so they help the player keep track of what those options are. B, the entire game world can't be intuitively designed to guide the player in a given direction, such as the case with having a large open world. Or C, in case the level design fails to guide the player on its own as a fallback plan. Now take the example set by the Mario series for good intuitive level design, and then look at something like Kaizo Mario or Cat Mario. These are meme games that effectively look at everything we just talked about in terms of good level design and takes every single one of them behind the woodshed. Unclear obstacles, deceptive platforming, traps that are impossible without using frame-perfect inputs that you could have only known about if you'd leveled divination beforehand. These are not hard platformers. No, Super Meat Boy is a hard platformer. Hollow Knight is a hard platformer. These are unfair platformers. And what makes them unfair isn't the difficulty or the fact that they're unbeatable, because they are beatable. They're just unfair because they're unintuitive. They're unfair because they subvert level design conventions in order to effectively lie to you. They don't guide the player in any meaningful way, and in fact, they punish the player for doing what similar games have trained them to do. The devs of games like these use their knowledge of level design in order to effectively do everything wrong and make a game that's frustrating on purpose. And for those that think the devs of these Kaizo games don't know anything about level design and that's why they're so bad, look at it this way. In order for you to get a 0 on a test, you needed to know how to avoid at least some of the right answers. Either way, in the cases of both the Kaizo ROM hacks or actual 2D Mario levels, the games are completely linear, which demonstrates that linearity on its own isn't the problem. Linearity only becomes a problem if being linear in your game doesn't make sense. And hopefully, that made it make sense. It's good to be back. Thank you all so much for watching as always. If you made it to the end, please consider subscribing. Shout out to Rusty for the top tier support over on Patreon. And I will see you, yes, you, next time.